Welcome to the Novaworks Learning Center. In this video, we will demonstrate how to tag a statement of shareholders' equity or deficit. First, let's go over the structure of an equity table. For the shareholders' equity table, each column represents a dimensional component of the shareholders' equity element. Columns that represent different types or classes of stock can have multiple columns for shares and amount. The rows of the table are used to express two different kinds of data. First, there are rows with date information. Second, there are rows that contain data which corresponds to XBRL elements. GoFiler has all the tools we need to easily tag this type of statement. The tools will look similar to functions we've already used to tag other items in our document, but the process is slightly different. Let's begin by going to our sample 10Q in GoFiler. Again, this document is available in GoFiler's Samples folder. At this point, we've used the XDX setup wizard to add the taxonomy and namespace to the document and tag the cover page. We also have used the XDX markup tools to tag the balance sheet and other simple financial statements. The first step in tagging the equity table is to mark the table as a statement, just like we did for the balance sheet. So place the cursor anywhere in the table and click Mark Table. This time, set the type to Statement Changes in Equity. Enter the name of the statement. Ours is Condensed Consolidated Statements of Stockholders' Deficit. Set the default precision and count it as. Our table is in thousands, so we will choose -3 thousands. Click OK. The table is tagged. Next, let's tag the columns with our dimension members. Our columns have one heading that is spanned. The Class A and Class B common stock heading spans over two separate data columns, the shares and the amount columns. XDX engrams must be placed in the first row of the table, so that span is going to cause problems. Usually you'll want to take care of problems like this during the HTML cleanup and formatting of your document, but I'm going to show you one method to handle the spanned heading. If we were to use the Insert Row Before function, the function would insert a row with a span. We can remove that span by splitting the cell, but I have a method for this table that is faster. I'm going to select a blank row in the table and copy it. Then I can place the cursor on the first cell of the first row and use paste. It inserted a blank row above our headings. This row has some non-breaking spaces in it, so it has some height. Depending on if you want the extra space before the table, you can remove the spaces after you add all the XDX tagging and set the height to 1 pixel. This will shrink the row down so it won't be visible in the browser. You can also see that when I inserted the row, it moved the table engram to the new row. If you delete the first row, it moves the table engram. So the software has some intelligence to it. It's going to keep that table engram in the right place if possible. Let's put my row back so we can start tagging. We have 4 data columns in this sample and one more column that is a total shareholders' equity, or in this case, deficit. The first column expresses shares. Columns that contain share data are a special case. I'm going to skip that column for now and come back to it in a little bit. Place the cursor in the first cell of the Amount column. Go to the XDX markup ribbon. Click the little arrow to the right of the Column Context button. This opens a menu with other column tagging tools. Choose Column with Dimension. This opens the Add Column Dimension dialog. We're going to choose our dimension and member elements for our column and set them here. First, each column is going to use the StatementEquityComponentsAxis, so let's use the element library to set our dimension to that. This column is the Common Stock Value column, so set the member to Common Stock Member. If you watched our previous tutorial, you're likely to remember that we had 2 classes of common stock, Class A and Class B. On our equity table, however, There is one column that is the total of both classes of common stock, so this dimension and member combination works for our data. Click Add, and then click OK to tag the column. Place the cursor in the next data column. This is the additional paid-in capital. Click the arrow button next to the Column Context button. Choose Column with Dimension. Set the dimension to StatementEquityComponentsAxis. And set the member to Additional Paid-in Capital Member. Click Add, and click OK. Repeat the process for accumulated deficit. Set the dimension. Choose the member. Click Add, and click OK. Now we're on the last column, which is our total column. Place the cursor in the column. Choose the Column with Dimension item. For this item, we're not going to set the dimension and member element. Instead, check the Total of all dimensional context option. This is going to designate the column as the total column. Click OK. The columns are tagged. Now let's go ahead and tag the rows. There are two types of rows: rows with date information and rows with data. We'll start with the date rows. You can tag all the date rows first and then tag the other rows with the elements, or vice versa. Or you can go down the table and tag them in order. It doesn't really make any difference. My table is small, so I'm going to do both the date rows and then my data rows. Place the cursor in the first date row. Click the arrow button next to the row element function. This opens the menu with the other row tagging tools. Choose Row with Date. To determine the date information for the row, you need to look at the other headings near it in the table. Even though the row may have language such as balance as of or balance at, we're going to create a duration context that is the period between this heading and the next one. This heading is December 31st, 2018, and the next is March 31st, 2019. The duration between them is the 3 months ended March 31st, 2019. The period does not include the starting date. I can use the preset list to set the information in the dialog, or I can set the options manually. There are no dimensions or members for my data. If there was a legal entity or other component to this data, then I might need to add dimensions here. Click the Next button. The next step sets the element for the row. You only need to set an element for the row if you have data in the row. Some filers like to have headings that are separated from the data. Others like to combine the date heading and the value for the shareholders' equity. Our sample is the latter. We have a date heading that shows the balance at a particular date. The element in this case is the stockholders' equity element. Choose whichever stockholders' equity element corresponds to your data. We previously selected the stockholders' equity element for the balance sheet because our company uses this element to express the stockholders' equity line item, so this is the element we're going to use here. This element is an instant element, and our context is a duration context, so we're going to use the period match option to specify the exact date for the data on this row. The row is as of December 31st, 2018, so this is the beginning of the period. Set the period match to Beginning. Click Finish. We can do the same thing for the next date row. Because there are no line items after this date, we could tag this line with an element only. By using the date heading, we could add additional periods easily. Place the cursor in the row. Click Row Element. Set the element. And because this is the end of the last period in the table, set the period match to End. If this line represented data at the date between the first starting date and the last ending date in the entire table, then you would continue to use the Beginning option. In other words, use the Beginning option for each date row in the table except the final date row. Click OK. Now we can tag all the line items between each date row. Place the cursor in the first data row. Click Row Element. Set the element. Check the options, which are all OK. Click OK. We'll continue this process for each line item and set the element for each. For this line item, we're going to create a custom element. This tutorial isn't going to dive too deep into how and when you should create an extension element for a filing. There are some resources out there and some guidance from the SEC that you can look into for information on that. As a general rule, consider whether there is an existing taxonomy element that is appropriate for the specific disclosure, and keep in mind that you should not use custom elements for data that you can express using dimensions. If you do find that you need to create an extension, as we do for this line item, the process is very simple. As with other line items, place the cursor in the appropriate row. Click Row Element. Instead of using the XBRL element library, enter a custom element name into the element field. You'll see here that the dialog says this is a new extension. Because this is a new extension, we need to set some information for the element. Choose the data type. The data type for our element is monetary. Select a period type. In this case, it is duration. Set the balance type. You can leave this blank if there's a reason to do so. However, our element is a credit item. Click OK to create the extension. We'll have to add documentation for this item later. We'll cover that in a later tutorial. Here's another line item that uses a custom element. We'll do the same for this one. Enter the element name. Set the data type. Set the period type, and set the balance type. Click OK. There's one last custom item here. Repeat the same process. Then back to tagging the next item, which uses the standard US GAAP net income loss element. Now we've tagged everything on the table except the data in the shares column. These items must be block tagged. Place the cursor in the first cell with data. Our first row, which is the balance at December 31st, 2018, has data. Click Block Fact. Enter the element. Ours is the common stock shares outstanding element. This is an instant element, so we need to set the period match to beginning. We can also set the label for this item. If we leave it blank, our report will use the default label for the element. The SEC's XBRL viewer will automatically add date information to the labels for each of these items. For inline viewing, the label will look like the HTML text. Click Next. Set the context for the item. The context will use the dimension and member combination for the common stock component. Click Next. Click Finish. Before I move on to the next shares item, I'm going to take a moment to copy the label for this row. I'm going to base the label for the shares on this one, so this is going to save time and typing. Click Block Fact. Set the element. Set the label. Click Next. Set the context. Click Next, and then click Finish. Move on to the next shares item. Now we can tag the last item for the shares, which is the ending balance. Once that is done, we've completed the equity table. As with other tables, you would add footnote references as needed, and any parenthetical data would be tagged using the inline fact tool. And that concludes this tutorial on tagging the shareholders equity table. Thanks for watching.